Right, this is a recording, 78 RPM shellac record, produced in the late 1920s by the International Educational Society, who produced these really for a sort of distribution really around the empire, and to try and educate the world in English and British ways. And this is the subject of Thomas Hardy, Lecture 11, Part 1, Thomas Hardy, the great novelist and poet, by his great friend who knew him personally, the late Sir Edmunde Goss. So by the time the record was produced, Edmund Gosse had passed away as well. Edmund Gosse was a famous poet in his own right, and if I'm not mistaken, I think he may have been the English Poet Laureate at some point as well.
On a solemn occasion in 1784, Gerard Hamilton wrote, "Samuel Johnson is dead. Let us go to the next best. There is nobody." We should do a grave injustice to several younger veterans of genius if we declare that nobody can take the place of Thomas Hardy, since one or other of them will presently slip into preeminence. But for the moment there is no visible head to the profession of letters in this country. The throne is vacant, and literature is gravely bereaved. It would be conventional, it would even be insincere to allege that literature has lost anything by Hardy's death. He preserved to a very great, perhaps to an unprecedented age, the power of expression, and it will be found that even in his 88th year, he added something to his life's achievement. But practically his work was over. The cup was drained to its final drop, although the wine was excellent to the last. It is not in actual production that we have anything to regret. The loss is in the presence of the man himself, in his dignified and beautiful position as the last representative of English literature. Till his death, if an Englishman of culture was asked, "Who is the present head of your literature?" instinctively, without fear of discussion, he would be answered, "Why, of course, Thomas Hardy." It is of great benefit to the intellectual life of a country that the years of a very great writer should be prolonged. It brings all other manifestations of talent into focus. It gives them proportion. In the case of Hardy, everything contrived to give dignity to his situation, his modesty, his serenity, his equipoise of taste, combined with the really extraordinary persistence of his sympathy and curiosity, made him an object of affectionate respect to old and young alike. He had outlived all adverse comment. He seemed to have entered into immortality without ceasing to be the simplest of mortals. It has been my privilege to enjoy his friendship for 53 years, a long span, and all through that time I have watched with care the development of his fame, which was at one time grossly and fanatically attacked. Looking backward over that long period, I am struck by the concinnity of his intellectual career, in his calmness, in his retirement, in his rigorous probity. He was always unconsciously preparing for a revered length of days and for an unchallenged predominance. This is not the moment for attempting to make a final pronouncement about the character of Hardy's works in detail. They will occupy 100 pens and will be subjected to close analysis by every variety of commentator. It is the fashion to overestimate his poetry, which will require to be sifted and selected. It is the fashion to underrate his novels, which form a solid contribution to the monument of English literature. Criticism will hold the balance more evenly, and will show that this remarkable man was equally distinguished in the two arts of prose and verse.
Right, part 2 of this International Educational Society 12-inch 78 RPM shellac record. Thomas Hardy, discussed by his his great friend, the late Sir Edmunde Goss, who, as I said before, was a poet in his own right.
Hardy kept the two completely distinct, yet always closely related. In both there is dominant the note of what he very much disliked to hear called pessimism, but what may be more accurately defined in words of his own as the sad science of renunciation. He needed all the magical genius to prevent his work, interpenetrated as it was by this resigned and hopeless melancholy, from becoming sterile. But joy streamed into it from other sources, the joy of observation, of sympathy, of humour. Yet after all, the core of Hardy's genius was austere and tragical, and this has to be taken into consideration and weighed in every estimate of his writings. It was a curious fact and difficult to explain that this obvious aspect of his temperament was the one which he firmly refused to contemplate. The author of the Death of the D'Urbervilles conceived himself to be an optimist. This characteristic of his life work, however, is too prominent to be overlooked even in the most rapid survey, since it constantly occupied the attention of his readers. In contrast with the Victorian optimism of which Robert Browning and George Meredith were eminent exponents, Thomas Hardy insisted on recognizing those elements in life which are disappointing and disconcerting. The optimists cried out that all was for the best in the best of all possible worlds. To this Hardy replied, if way to the better there be, it exacts a full look at the worst. This full look at the worst was condemned by his critics as pessimism, and Hardy resented the application. When he was charged with having assumed the opinions of Schopenhauer, he insisted that long before he heard the name of that German philosopher, his sense of the unsatisfactory nature of human experience was completely formed. He would not allow that any other mind had influenced his, and he was probably right. His so-called pessimism is based on pity for the sorrows and imperfections of his fellow creatures, and on an inability to trace in their fate any intelligible plan. It is not the egotism of Byron, nor the morbid melancholy of Chateaubriand. It is directed towards an observation of others, not towards an analysis of self, and this gives it more philosophical importance, because although romantic peevishness is very common among modern poets, and although ennui inspires a multitude of sonnets, yet a deliberate and imaginative study of useless suffering in the world around us is rare indeed. It is particularly to be noted that Thomas Hardy, although one of the most profoundly tragic of all modern writers, is neither effeminate nor sickly. His sadness could never have dictated the third stanza to Shelley's lines written in dejection by the Bay of Naples. His pessimism is involuntary, forced from him by his experience and by his constitution. He says, "O life with the sad, scared face, I weary of seeing thee, and thy draggled cloak, and thy hobbling pace, and thy too forced pleasantry. I know what thou wouldst tell of death, time, destiny. I have known it long, and know too well what it all means for me."
Right, part 3 of this International Educational Society 78 RPM shellac record. It's the late Sir Edmunde Goss, who must have passed away while they were making the record, speaking about his great friend, the great Thomas Hardy.
When we turn from personal considerations to the body of work which this famous man has left behind him, we are struck at once with the variety and unity which are combined in its composition. It is like a triumphal arch, consisting of 2 columns of magnificent proportions, united by an architrave or frieze of splendid ornament. The columns are his prose novels on the one hand, and his lyrical poems on the other, while the frieze above them both, joining them into one monument, is his majestic triple drama of the dynasts. These three sections of Hardy's work are quite independent, and each may be considered alone, while each of them is in close intellectual and moral relation to the other. They form as singular a trinity of talent as can be met with in the whole history of literature. Let us first glance at the novels. Planets, which a number of highly characteristic short tales accompany as satellites. They are 14 in number, beginning with Desperate Remedies in 1871 and closing with The Well-Beloved in 1897. There has been much speculation as to the reason why the author ceased to write novels 30 years before his death. But I think there need be sought no other cause than the fact that he had, by the end of Jude the Obscure, made all the observation of contemporary life in Wessex which he cared to make. He left off when his powers of narrative were at their height, lest he should be tempted to repeat himself. The 14 novels, without exception, deal with the manners and conditions of rustic life in one single province of southern England, that district between Winchester and Exeter, and from the Thames to the Channel, which Hardy was the first to make generally known by the name of Wessex. It is particularly of the county of Dorset that he writes best, since this is the region which he knows best. Its landscape, its villages, the men and women who inhabit it, have a character of their own which had not been perceived until this typical Dorsetshire lad, who happened to be a writer of genius, presented to the world a series of pictures of the concentrated passion and the peculiar adventures of its inhabitants at the moment when the railway and the telegraph were breaking down the barrier between the interior of Wessex and the world outside. The best novels of Hardy are those which are most local, most highly charged with the impressions which he received in his boyhood between 1850 and 1860. In my judgment, the characteristics of Hardy's prose fiction are to be studied to the best advantage in three of his novels which are not the most popular. These are The Return of the Native, in which realism and romance are united on a canvas of broad proportions, The Woodlanders, in which Hardy's sense of natural beauty in harmony with rustic human character is seen in its highest development, and The Mayor of Casterbridge, where the inexorable nature of Nemesis is illustrated in unequal fullness.
Right, here's the fourth and final part of this lecture on Thomas Hardy by his friend Sir Edmunde Goss. It's probably the only recording of Edmund Gosse, as well as a well-known poet, so it's great to hear his voice. Such a pity that Thomas Hardy was never recorded. He lived on into the age where he could have been recorded onto wax cylinder, but never actually made it to be recorded, unfortunately. So let's finish this. Really interesting. It's he speaks with great affection of his friend, and Thomas Hardy was such a great novelist. He forgot to mention on the last side that Hardy is believed to have given up writing novels 30 years before he died, because he was absolutely sickened by the criticism of his last novel, Jude, and from the rest of his life he concentrated on writing poems, and wrote some absolutely fantastic poems. I love Thomas Hardy. Enjoy.
As in his novels, so in his lyrical poems, Hardy chose to remain local, to be the interpreter for present and future times of one rich province of the British realm which his predecessors had neglected. But in the great triple drama of the dynasts, on which he was engaged for so many years of his fullest maturity, the local impression has disappeared, or rather the poet seems to have soared from his native heaths to to a height from which the whole of Europe at a distance of over 100 years is spread before him like a map. He gazes down from the vault of heaven and with a sort of angelic omniscience perceives what is happening in small things as in great, in the hearts of crafty statesmen and in the movement of colossal armies. This difficult and sublime production, one of the most surprising which have been written in our age, is doubtless Hardy's masterpiece, and will perhaps be the most permanent of his writings. Of Hardy's lyrical poems, the world of readers knew nothing until 1898, when at the approach of his 60th year, he published the collection called Wessex Poems. The critics were at first not prepared to welcome an elderly novelist in any entirely new guise, but he insisted, and during the remaining years of his life, he published 7 such collective volumes. The truth is that though even his friends were not aware of the fact, he had been a writer of verse from his boyhood. In Wessex Poems, the dated pieces go back to 1865. The character of these hundreds of lyrics and versified narratives has been consistent from first to last. In the author's language, grave, positive, stark delineations are interspersed in them among those of a passive, lighter, and more traditional sort. In them all, with occasional hardness of utterance, there is to be found a marvelous skill in composition. The author has something definite to say, and he chooses to sing it. If it will not come easily, he overcomes its resistance. It comes, and he forces it to take proper aesthetic form. It is interesting to observe the contrast in this respect between Hardy and Swinburne, in whom lyric utterance are offered not the slightest difficulty. Both are poetical artists of high value in totally different schools. To early readers of his poems, before the full meaning of them became evident, Hardy's voice sounded inharmonious because it did not fit in with the sophisticated melodies of the later Victorian age. But he did not attempt to modify his utterance in the least. And now we can all perceive that what seemed to himself harsh in his poetry was his peculiar and personal mode of interpreting his thoughts. The external life of Thomas Hardy was uneventful to the last degree. He took a quiet part in the local business of the province which he made so illustrious. He travelled little. He made few and unobtrusive public appearances. He neither shrank from company nor courted it. Those who saw him superficially thought him unexhilarating. To appreciate his wit and wisdom, it was desirable to be alone with him. The close of his life was extremely serene, and I think perfectly happy. He was the object of devoted care and the closest sympathetic attention. Of this I must beware of saying too much. If this be she who, gentlest of the wise, taught, soothed, loved, honored the departed one, let me not vex with inharmonious sighs the silence of that heart's accepted sacrifice.